Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Roger McKenzie, Assistant General Secretary of UNISON. And this is part of our contribution towards the TUC Heart Unions Week. And what we thought we would do, we being the strategic organising unit of UNISON, is to think about the contribution that can be made by just acknowledging the importance of our history. Now, I know that some people might sit around and say, well, what's that got to do with what's going on today? Well, that's what we're going to talk about, is maybe some of the influences that we can glean from our history, but also some of the inspiration, I think, some of the real lessons that can be drawn from both our defeats and victories, depending on what you count as a defeat and victory, which is a whole discussion in itself, which we might start on in this discussion as well. Can I introduce our two guests? Firstly, Professor Mary Davies, long-time friend and colleague and comrade of mine from going way back, who at one point even was a supervisor on an ill-fated attempt by me to do a PhD, which I'm hoping that she'll one day forgive me for not completing, but I've never forgiven myself for completing, to be honest, and maybe we'll go back to. Our other guest is Bob Kelly, Education Officer from our Northwest region, also a long-time friend and comrade from way, way back, actually, as well, going back to the mid-1980s, I guess, I think. Two long-standing friends, both of whom have a keen interest and involvement in labour history. And that's what I want to talk about: labour history, trade union history, our movement's history, and to look at what we can learn from our history that's going to help us to deal with the challenges of today. So I guess maybe starting with you, Mary, is just to that question that I kind of hinted at the beginning. So why bother thinking or talking about our history in the labour movement?
Well, I don't think we can understand the present without understanding the past. That's firstly. And secondly, for the labour movement, it's vitally important that workers themselves not only study, but learn from and write and reconstruct their own history, because it's been left really far too often just to academics. And I think workers should be involved in this. I don't think that I wanted just to talk about why it's important to learn from not just defeats, but also from victories. And later on, if you want me to, I'd like to mention three important victories, which I do think we can learn from for today, because we've had too many defeats and not enough victories.
Well, let's come back to that, because I definitely do want to celebrate our victories. And Bob, I mean, why do you think it's important for us to look at our history when we're trying to deal with everyone's struggling today, trying to just keep bread on the table, keep a roof over their heads? How would history help with that?
I mean, well, from an education point of view, as someone who trains stewards and activists, then I think if we need to put things into context, we need to understand what happened in the past. So if you take if we talk to people about the 2016 Trade Union Act, for instance, and the restrictions on ballots, so then you have to say, well, where did the ballots come from? So you have to then go back to the 1980s and talk about the legislation that was introduced in the 1980s. And then you say, so why did they need to introduce that legislation? So then you have to go back to the 1970s and talk about the 1970s and where, we were bringing Tory governments down, etc. And then, of course, you could even go further, because then someone might ask the question, so what's the definition of a trade dispute? So you'd have to then go back to 1906 to the Trade Disputes Act to find that definition. And then you could also then start talking, well, why did the Trade Disputes Act come about? Well, that came about because there was a strike in Tap Vale in South Wales. And also then you can even expand it and start talking about the foundation of the Labour Party. So, I mean, that's an example of to be able to understand and put things into context I think we always have to go back in time and find out where these things are coming from.
I mean, there's a kind of assumption here that there's, which I'm not, this is from me as well, and it's really worth kind of just addressing for a minute, I think, about where we learn this stuff, because you can. I mean, all of us have said so far it's really, it's important to have this, but it seems to me the spaces to have these discussions have reduced over the years. I mean, I remember when I went on my first stage 1 shop stewards course. I was a NUPE shop steward back in 1981. I went on my first shop stewards course, and I remember we talked about some of this stuff at that time. Is this something now? I mean, maybe Mary, you can maybe pick this up and then you follow in, Bob. But is this somewhere? Are there still the spaces to have these discussions, both on the shop stewards courses, member courses, outside of each individual union's kind of experience? Are there still the spaces to do these sorts of discussions, Mary?
Well, I think they're less and less. I mean, I was involved really since the Employment Protection Act of 1978 in courses for shop stewards, which did include a lot of. There was a presumption behind them that there was actually a struggle between capital and labour, and it wasn't just learning how to represent people in grievances and disciplinaries, but it was actually learning about the movement itself. Then I was part of involved in the Centre for Trade Union Studies, and that's where we not only taught shop stewards courses, but we also developed a ladder of opportunity from shop stewards really up until PhDs for workers. So labour history was a key part of that. Now, I think a lot of that's gone, but we do have 2 important places that we can still teach labour history from a perspective which it does understand what the conflicts were. That is the Working Class Movement Library and Marx Memorial Library, of which I'm secretary, and we do a large number and an increasing number of courses for workers. It's called Marx Memorial Library and Workers' School, and we really work hard to make sure the Workers' School side of it, which includes, of course, so much labour history, and that's increasingly popular, actually, particularly during lockdown. We've expanded the number of courses and the number of people who are interested in ideas, interested actually in Marxism as well, because we are Marx Memorial Library. And I think probably Bob can say more about the Working Class Movement Library, which does similar work to us. So there are these at least 2 repositories of which are there for workers history.
Bob, do you want to say a little bit about your experience in the Working Class Movement Library?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think history does still play a part on our courses. We start, I mean, certainly the TUC Stewards course still has a section on labour history in it. And basically every course I teach, because my background is being a historian, is I always introduce history into it. But the Working Class Movement Library in Salford, I don't know if a lot of people don't seem to realise it's there. But if you drive in on the A6 into Manchester, you'll probably pass it by Salford University. It's a wonderful institution that houses a huge collection of working class history, documents, pamphlets, banners, all kinds of stuff. And it's and hopefully when this horrible pandemic is over, people can come and visit us and look around it. And we also put on lots of events. There still is. We're still running lots of online events, and I would say to anyone, if they're interested, is that they go to the website, the Working Class Movement Library website. You'll see there's a whole range of events that we're still running during the lockdown.
I mean, one of the most inspiring things for me about looking back on our history is delving into all of those people who tend to get written out of working class history. I mean, Mary, I mean, you've written loads of great stuff about this. I mean, one of your books in particular, Comrade or Brother?
Question mark.
Question mark, absolutely. And I think, I mean, and for those of you watching, listening to this, I mean, I'm on no commission at all for this, but it is a book worth reading, because far too often, too many people who've been pivotal to our movement who get written out. The same with, I mean, we need some more stuff written on black workers who've been written out of our history as well. There's a little project for me, maybe. There you go. There you go. Comrade or Brother? Question mark. Right. But that's my commission, not Bob's, right? But I think that for me, this is one of the kind of things that we need to make sure is part of whatever it is that we're talking about in terms of our movement's history, is that we take the care to ensure that everybody is talked about. It's not just one group of us. Mary?
Well, you're absolutely right, Roger. I mean, what we're looking at is people who are hidden from history, who actually made a big difference. And that, I think, means that we have to examine not just the leadership, but also people who were, as it were, call it the rank and file. And that's, for me, is one of the lessons of history, and one of the key thing to learn from history. And just when the rare occasions when we have major victories, i.e. victories which resulted in either a change of government or a change of government policy, what you can see is that it's a political issue. It's when people have got consciousness that they know that change is necessary, and that movement from below then influences the leadership. The leadership, and I hope you don't mind my saying this because on the UNISON course, but on its own will just carry on doing what it's doing. And it's the same with everything. It's only when there is a mass movement from below, and I mean, maybe we haven't got time to talk about those, what I think are key pivotal victories. We can talk about defeats, and that's, but I think this is called Organising Lessons from Our History. And I think it's quite important to think about when we were successful just as much as when we weren't.
Yeah.
And if you want me to, and if there's time, I'll just mention at least three. And
we'll definitely come on to that in a minute. I'm just trying to get a feel, get some of the context behind it, right? Because I don't want people to go away thinking that we're just talking about white men, right, in our movement. We need to be clear that there have been, lots and lots of people who've made a contribution to this labour movement that have to date never been written about, but are the people who've made things happen, who've made a difference in workplace. I mean, you'll both know that I'm a big student of and activist in black trade union movements. And many of those things are never thought about as being important drivers of change within our movement. It's always like someone's doing us a favour. And that's never the case, in my view. Bob, have you got a...
It's because the definition of the working class has not...
Exactly. Exactly.
Women and black people, and that's a very, very, very bad mistake, that a political mistake that's been made throughout labour history. And so what's happened is that the history of black people and the history of women has been written separately. What it has to do is to come together in order to redefine the working class as not white and male, because it wasn't. Full stop.
Yeah. And we've seen some of that stuff in reflected in UK kind of parliamentary politics at the minute, aren't we? For the last few years, where talk about the working class is actually being used to exclude people. Bob, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think the point that Mary made about raising people's consciousness and being involved in things, but also empowering people. One of the great things is when you're involved in trade unions. I mean, I haven't been involved in trade union education for a long time now. Is seeing people being empowered and bringing them on, and all kinds of different people in that respect. I mean, what's the name? And I think you're right. What's the name? What we need to do is uncover those hidden histories of people. One of the things we did with the Black members group in the Northwest last year for Black History Month was we did something with the People's History Museum in Manchester with William Cuffey, who was a black chartist. Yeah, so this was a black man who was leading a leading working class activist in the 1830s and 40s in Britain. And that went down really well because a lot of people hadn't heard about William at all, and I think we need to find other examples of that to highlight that as Mary says, that the working class encompasses all working people.
Absolutely. Mary, do you want to just talk a little bit about those 3 disputes that you...
Well, there's three. The 3 I can think of are 3 that actually changed government policy. The first was in 1920, when it was the result, really, again, of political consciousness of support. The workers who supported the Russian Revolution forced the government, through the Hands Off Russia campaign and later the formation of the Councils of Action, to change government policy, i.e. to defeat Winston Churchill's desire to go and smash the Russian Revolution through leading these 14 armies in the wars of intervention. And that actually resulted in a change in the government's foreign policy. It was absolutely amazing. And the key thing was the movement from below was so strong that it forced both the leadership of the TUC and the Labour Party eventually to have a huge conference and setting up councils, a national council for action to smash or to change government policy. 400 councils of action were established throughout the country. So that's one. I mean, it was a very political era where people were learning lessons and wanting to change policy influenced by the Russian Revolution. The other case was actually what Bob was talking about, why it was that the Industrial Relations Act was eventually, or a series of industrial relations that were passed by Thatcher, and that was because of the defeat of the government in 1974, owing to a mass movement from below, which eventually led to the Heath government being overthrown and the Labour Party. I mean, there's a lot to say about that, and Bob has referred to it. And the third one is a victory for women. The first, very little is really written. There is a book written about it, but it's not integrated. This fantastic strike at Trico, and this was an equal. This is the first, not the first. It's actually the second successful equal pay strike. Actually, it's the first, to be perfectly honest. Absolutely for equal pay, and one of the reasons why that worked and why it was won was because the women were fantastically well organised and involved. They were members of the Amalgamated Engineering Workers Union, which was a very male-dominated union, didn't admit women until 1946, but there was a change in the leadership of that movement, and it was an official strike. So in other words, the lesson that I draw is that when there's a huge movement from below that can influence the leadership, that's when it's possible to win. But there has to be that movement, and there has to be, again, say it again, a change in the consciousness, people knowing why they need to win and forcing that. So I don't think you can leave out politics from this, because it's basically people who are socialists who are leading this movement from below. And that's the key thing. Key people who therefore understood the dynamic of the relationship between capital and labour. And that's why trade unions were formed in the first place. But we seem to forget that lesson. There is always that contradiction. And that's the basis, really, of trade unionism, to put it in a nutshell. Very simple.
No, that's great. I mean, Bob, have you got any examples?
Yeah, I was I had to last week when I was asked to do this, and I was trying to think of some examples to fit in with organising and what we can actually learn from organising. And I came up. I've come up with 3. The first one was funny enough. There was from an article that was in the Morning Star a couple of weeks back,
A
which was
paper everybody should read, in my view.
is the on the Upper Clyde shipyards disputes, which is the 50th anniversary this year.
Oh yeah.
And yeah, like you know, what's his name? I mean, I'm supposed to be a Labour historian, and what's his name? You forget about some of the disputes that we had, you know, until you're reminded. So of course, you know, I read the article, and then I've gone away and read up some more on it. And if you want to be inspired, you know, then read about this dispute. This is where 8,000 shipyard workers took over the shipyards and had a working for 15 months and continued to build ships. Yeah. And actual fact, increase productivity as well, I think, at the same time themselves. And what an amazing achievement. And of course, it also contributed, by the way, to the fall of the Conservative government that Mary mentioned as well. But from an organising point of view, if you think about it, to be able to organise that, well, I mean, you can call it a dispute, but it was a working. The number of meetings and talks that they had to do with local business leaders, because local businesses had to supply the things to the yards to build the ships. They had to go out and talk to the community leaders, religious leaders, etc., to get them on board. I mean, they even got some Scottish Tories on board during the dispute as well, because what's his name was that important. So it's learning how to what's his name about organising should be about bringing other people in into the dispute and getting that support. And of course, there was huge support in Glasgow in Scotland for the dispute from the public as well. The other one, which is sorry, the other similar disputes and talking about getting public support from an organising point of view, I thought about was the ambulance dispute in 1989, 1990, which is a great example, I think. First of all, I mean, from an organising point of view, of using the media to your advantage, which was done at the time, and you probably remember Roger Poole being on the telly virtually every evening talking about the ambulance workers dispute. And I think in these days when we're talking about new media and about making use of new media, like we're trying to do today, Roger, to a certain extent, is how we do that. And we can learn certainly from the lessons from that ambulance dispute about how the media was used, television and radio, to get the message across, etc. And it was done in a really good way. They also took advantage of the fact that the rolling news had just been introduced, like the Sky 24-hour news thing, and that helped what's his name, because they were all looking for stories and things. So I think that what's his name, learning from now those how you at the time, what's there, what you need, what you use to your advantage, and of course because, and also the way it was put across the dispute in the media. So Roger was talking about the British ambulance workers, etc., and actually sort of garnered public support for it. I mean, to the extent that I think there was a petition where 4.5 million people signed a petition in favour, and I think that actually holds the record as the biggest petition, one of the biggest petitions ever in those terms. And I also remember myself being involved in that, collecting money for that dispute, and also we had the famous 15-minute during a lunchtime demonstrations around the country, and I can remember blockading the main roads coming into Liverpool where I worked at the time, with other factories that were on the road, workers from other factories were on the road, and it was just a great, a great way of getting public support and using the media. So I thought that's a really good example. And the last one I was going to mention, and somebody could question whether this is actually history, but it did happen a couple of years ago. So I suspect I'm claiming it's historic, yeah. And that's the dispute that we had in the northwest at Wigan and Lee hospitals. where, I mean, on the back of that 2016 Trade Union Act, the restrictions on the ballot, we had to basically, to get a turnout for a dispute now, to get a yes vote for a dispute, you've got to get 80% turnout. And this is one of the first disputes that we encountered. And again, it was a great example because it came. There's a couple of things that happened. First of all, it did, what Mary mentioned earlier. This came from below, and the dispute was about the trust setting up a subsidiary company and transferring 800 NHS workers into the subsidiary company. And that dispute came about because the workers involved were some of the lowest paid domestics and catering staff, porters, etc. And some of them turned up at the branch meeting, and for the first time, by the way, they'd never ever been to a branch meeting, and turned up and basically demanded that the branch did something about this. So that's where it started from. And they went on to lead the dispute and become active part in the dispute, what's known. But also what we did in the Northwest on the back of the 2016, we created a disputes team where we had some organisers that would help branches if they were in dispute. And we brought them in. And what we did was we held lots of meetings with members beforehand, before we actually went to the ballot and got them involved in the dispute right from the get-go. And so we generated the support right from the start. And I think that's what we need to be doing. I mean, I've argued that the 2016 to actually did us a favour, because we actually now do this properly when we come to disputes about organising ballots and get workers involved in that respect. So again, I think that we can learn from those type of disputes as well.
I mean, I think one of the things from our discussion that's kind of clear to me. I mean, Mary, you've kind of interpreted a victory as being let's change government policy, clear, right? Unarguable, right? If change government policy through the actions of working people, that's always a victory, because that doesn't happen that often, frankly, right? So when it does, you've got to claim that as a victory. But sometimes we lose disputes, and sometimes we're still able to claim victory. And for me, that's part of the beauty of history, in a way, that we're able to look back and say, yes, they might not have got everything that they wanted in that dispute, or that they set out to achieve in that dispute, but over time we can see the impact of that dispute. Yeah.
Trico was not a victory of the government. I mean, that was an equal. I mention it because it was an equal pay strike which won, and I know there was one in Glasgow recently.
Yeah,
UNISON was involved, which won. So you're right, and you could sort of look at something like the Pentonville 5, 1972, where of course they didn't win an overall victory, and the Liverpool dockers strike. I mean, massive, and also 1984 to 5, the miners' strike. I mean, the support for the miners and that organising, they didn't win, but it was incredible that, that there was this mass mobilisation, and we weren't strong enough. Why weren't we strong enough? We need to actually analyse that, and the role of the media, and of course the role of the government, that was actually stronger. And you can say the 1926 general strike, which actually the TUC sold out on. But I mean, again, the government was so organised, and we need to look at the role of the state. I mean, they had their own private armies. They were already, years before the strike, they were, the organisation, the maintenance supplies was formed. They were. So you have to look at the role of the state and the role of capital, because they're strong, and that's why we have to be very much stronger. I only mentioned those two dates because actually it's unusual that we could actually win and change the government, but we have won strikes. You're dead right. And I think UCS is a terrific example, and the lessons for today, that building that broad unity, I would call it building a popular front. And that's what, if you think about the COVID crisis now, desperately need to have a kind of a massive popular front led by workers, but involving others in the demands for what is going to be a dreadful future after this. If we ever win this, not win, but if ever the pandemic is and COVID is, it won't be eradicated, but the fallout from this year. I mean, obviously this is something you're going to discuss elsewhere, so it's not my point. But I just think that lessons from history, like building a popular front as opposed to just a united front, is really important. We won in Cable Street as well in 1936, and that was a good example of a broad alliance led actually by Jewish people and by communists, and that's often forgotten. Again, it's a question of consciousness and raising consciousness, understanding what fascism is. And and that's the role of, I think that, for example, the role of these libraries is to help to understand that and build the consciousness of workers, you know, who are at the front line of struggle. We always say that, you know, the organised labour movement has to be, and if it's not, nothing will change. The organised labour movement is the key to everything.
No, absolutely, couldn't agree more. And I mean, one of the most important things that personally I get from our history, well, two things really for me personally. The first is the importance of movement building. That you know, you can't just isolate people and, you know, just expect, you know, wait for the hero to come along.
Exactly. Yeah.
On their own, because it has never happened that, you know, we have individuals who get picked out, right? But actually the important thing is the movement that guides people, that pushes things along, that puts those of us who are in leadership positions in difficult positions sometimes, in places that sometimes we don't want to be, but the movement is pushing, and for me that's important. The other thing for me personally is, and this is maybe something that I'm going to ask you both to come back and have another discussion with me about at some point, is and I know you in particular, because I'm guessing Bob's had thoughts about this and done work on it, but I know Mary has, and that is the role of trade unions in empire. Because for me, as a black person, as a black trade unionist, as a black worker, it's almost like we've been faced with this thing where people think, like my parents, and they're, you know, just arrived with no kind of movement kind of history, with no trade union history. The fight against colonialism was just an aberration, presumably, and none of that involved real people, just some stars from way back who had led revolts, and people didn't act, and yet we all know that people were part of movements against colonialism, built the trade union movements that fought against colonialism, and then came over to this country and participated in the movements in this country. And we can see that from people who came over from not just the Caribbean, but also from Africa, and also, of course, from India, and the magnificent role of the Indian Workers Association, and all of that. And I just think that's an important part of British trade union history as well.
You're absolutely right. But what we have to, as you know, we were trying to work on this Black Trade Unionist Oral History project.
Yeah.
But and you were involved in that. But the issue, I think, is not only recognising what you've just said, but also why it was that the trade union movement took so long to even think about this. And therefore, I think, and this is a question of consciousness, because unless people are conscious of the fact that racism was so deeply impregnated into all aspects of society from our British appalling colonial past, it also penetrated and impregnated the labour movement itself and the trade union movement. And but it can't be resolved unless it can be recognised, and it can only be recognised when there is actually political consciousness of the importance of this. So you're absolutely right to raise it, and I'm so glad you have. But it's racism and sexism impregnated our movement for a long time, which is why there were so few women involved. From the really, women only. We've just seen a few trade union leaders now, but actually, it's not just a question of leaders. It's a question of people who have been put in those positions, not pulling the ladder up behind them so that others can come forward. And I think we waited a long time. In fact, in some respects, I think we're going backwards when we see that all the struggles that we fought for to establish black workers' committees, women's committees in trade unions, have now been sort of incorporated into a massive sort of equality committee. That recognising racism and sexism is actually key to building a united working class movement. You know what, and the understanding that it's not white and male. We have to recognise why it's been like that for so long, and the impregnation, as I say, of racist and sexist ideas, which the movement has not been immune from, and still is not immune from it.
Absolutely. Bob, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, well, it's a couple of things. I think what Mary said. I think that what's important that we look at our own history and the sort of battles, if you like, that we have to have in our own movements around racism and sexism. Yeah, which are important. And interesting enough, that what was interesting is those battles or disputes or whatever we had within our own movements, then were followed within society later on. We're still having, as Mary said, we're still having those battles at the moment, and that's important for us to understand as well. That racism and sexism existed and still exists to some extent in the trade union movement itself. And the other thing, I think you mentioned empire, Roger, and I think since the events this year have sort of highlighted the role of empire in British society. And if we go back to the beginning and we were talking about historical context, about understanding the empire and the role of empire, not only in that in the context that you were talking about people coming over from the colonies and coming to Britain, but also the impact it actually had on British society itself, and still has. And it seems to be, it's ingrained into our society that there's some way that the empire was a great thing. And I think that's one of the we need to be questioning. We need to be talking and having a proper debate about the role of empire, not only on British society, but on the whole, on the world stage as well. And it's interesting. I'm really glad that that the events this year are starting to enable us to have those debates. I come from Liverpool. I don't know if you've guessed, but I come from Liverpool, and of course Liverpool was built on slavery. Yeah, exactly. And what's his name? And when we can get back in there, by the way, if you want to come to Liverpool, go to the Slavery Museum. It's well worth a visit. But we were, it was built on that. And what's his name? And you can't go anywhere in Liverpool without unless you understand the history. You'll know that what's his name? Everywhere you're surrounded by it. If you walk through the city centre, the streets are named after slave owners. We've got statues everywhere of slave owners. We've got buildings and stuff, and trying to understand that, I think, is really important. Yeah.
But I think this has been fascinating discussion, and genuinely, I'd like to invite you both back to have another discussion and continue this discussion around trade unions and empire, really, and both in terms of building the movements, the trade union movements in the so-called colonies, or as some of us call them, occupied territories, really, but also the impact of black workers and women workers and black women workers and so on, right, in this country, on the trade union movement, and how that led to for something that I've been involved in for many years, around the importance of self-organization and the role that brings to our movement. And as we have recognized within the within UNISON. That's why, you know, it's an absolutely integral part of our constitution as a union that we have not just proportionality, but we have self-organisation within our movement. It's absolutely critical to everything that we do as a movement. I'm so proud that we do that. But what that means for us to be able to face the struggles ahead, and that, in a nutshell, I think, is the kind of importance of our history. You know, if you understand where all that's coming from, you understand the position that we are in now, but it gives you some clues, I think, to what we can do, how we can face up to the challenges that we've got to deal with in the future on a whole range of fronts, not just COVID, but also like continued job losses as a result of COVID, the introduction of automation into the delivery of public services, replacing people's jobs with robots, all sorts of different things that we can get a grip on if we understand where we've come from and the way that working class people faced up to those challenges in the past. I think that's what we need to come back and have a, it's sounding more like a few discussions in the future actually rather than one. And yeah, God, yeah, no problem at all. Let's do that. Let's do it. I think if we're going to talk about trade union history, well, let's talk about trade union history, and you can't do it in 45 minutes. So let's have a few discussions about it. Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, can I genuinely thank you both, Professor Mary Davies, Bob Kelly, for giving up what I know is a really, really busy time for everybody at the minute. But thank you so much for taking the time to come on and have this discussion, the first of a series of discussions with me about different aspects of trade union history that I hope everybody has found interesting, but that going forward, hopefully we'll be able to get more people participating in a discussion as well with us about these issues. But been really good to have this discussion with you both. So can I thank you again? And look,
thank you, Roger, for inviting us.
That's fine. And look forward to having a chat again in the future. Thanks so much, everybody. And thanks for giving up your time, everybody, to listen in and watching with us. Thanks.
Cheers.
Thank you.